Welcome to this afternoon's Kellogg Institute lecture by Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. My name is Charles Levitt, and I'm Assistant Professor of Italian at Notre Dame and a Faculty Fellow of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. And I'd like to thank you for joining us for what promises to be a fascinating lecture. And I'd like to thank the Nanovic Institute for European Studies and the Center for Italian Studies for co-sponsoring this afternoon's event. Let me introduce today's speaker. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is Professor of History and Italian Studies at New York University. Her work has been supported by Fulbright, Guggenheim, and other fellowships, and her books, Fascist Modernities and Italian Fascism's Empire Cinema, detail what happens to societies when authoritarian governments take hold and explore the appeal of strongmen to collaborators and followers. In her writing for CNN, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and other news outlets, and in particular in her new book, Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present, Professor Ben-Ghiat provides critical and historical insights into fascism, authoritarian leaders, propaganda, and threats to democracy around the world, and how to counter them. And if I might interject a more personal note into my introduction, I've been an admirer of Professor Ben-Ghiat's work since I first read her 1991 essay, Neorealism in Italy, 1930 to 1950, From Fascism to Resistance, where she demonstrates the undeniable, but for many still the uncomfortable, continuities between Italian fascism and a post-war Italian culture that claimed to be entirely freed from fascist influence. Examining the historical record in rigorous detail, Professor Ben-Ghiat showed that it's difficult, perhaps impossible, to escape from fascism as quickly or as cleanly as Italian artists and intellectuals wish to suggest. And that's why I'm so anxious to hear Professor Ben-Ghiat's reflections this afternoon as she speaks to us about strongmen and their exits, legacies of authoritarian rule.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you so much. And thank you to Holly Rivers and Therese Hanlon, everybody at the Kellogg Institute, the Nanovic Center, and the Center for Italian Studies. So ours is the age of the strongman leader. And by this term, I'm referring to a subset of authoritarians who damage or destroy democracy, but also use machismo as a tool of political legitimacy. And such rulers govern today in Turkey and India, Russia, Hungary, Brazil, and until recently, the US. And I wrote Strongmen because I felt it was time to look back over a century of authoritarianism. And the book is not as much comparative politics, but a history. It's an evolution of how this style of rule has changed. So you have three eras that I try and I show through lines, but I have three eras: the era of fascism, the era of military coups, and our new authoritarian age, as I call it. So people come to power through elections, and then they have to manipulate elections to stay there. And in that latter, this last period, I focus on Putin and Berlusconi, who was a bit of a pioneer, and Trump, and Erdogan from Turkey is in there as well. And it's the first book to put Trump's presidency in the context of a history of authoritarianism. So it was written very much as an American concerned of what was going on in my own country. And the core of the book is the chapters on the tools of rule, as I call them, and they interweave, they interlink propaganda, corruption, the myth of national greatness, violence, and machismo. And then I have chapters on resistance, which all of them span 100 years. So it was very moving to me to write the chapter on resistance and see what tactics have changed and what have stayed the same. And then the chapter, which was the most interesting to research, which is the subject of today, is how they fall. And then I have a conclusion with some final, thoughts about what we can do to stop this rising authoritarianism. So the authoritarian playbook has no chapter on failure. And I want to say this is a little old school today. I don't have a PowerPoint, so bear with me. So nothing prepares the ruler to see his propaganda ignored and his charismatic hold on his people weaken until sometimes they turn against him. The authoritarian playbook has no pages on the horror of being voted out of office as happened to Chilean leader Augusto Pinochet, or forced into exile, like Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo or Idi Amin in Uganda. Democratic heads of state often see their departures from office as an opportunity to think about their legacy. They move on. Authoritarian leaders don't move on. They're constitutionally, psychologically, very badly equipped to move on from power. And they see the end of their time in office as a kind of psychological annihilation, because they grow addicted to adulation, to control of bodies, of national resources, and that's where the corruption comes in. And they also often have practical concerns about the end of immunity from prosecution for themselves and their families. So they tend to do desperate things to stay in office. And political scientists have a term for this called gambling for resurrection. Sometimes they start wars, or they try a self-coup, as we've seen more recently here. And as the reality of their eclipse dawns, they grow increasingly vindictive and reckless. So it's a very dangerous time, the end of a despot's time in office, whether it's in the 20th century or the 21st. So first, I want to go over some conditions that explain why they are so ill-equipped to leave. And I work in the book with the concept of personalist rule. And it's important for understanding why they just do so badly in leaving office. So personalist rule, or governance, concentrates power in one individual whose own political and financial interests and relationships with other despots, often financial or other relationships, come to prevail over national ones in foreign and domestic policy. In a sense, it's a kind of personalization or privatization of policy. So the ruler's individual financial needs are tantamount. And loyalty, rather than expertise or professionalism, become the main requirement for serving him. So among today's liberal leaders, Putin and Erdogan and Orban and Bolsonaro govern in this fashion, as did Trump, who turned the GOP into his personal tool with quite astonishing speed. And as we go on in time, we will appreciate more what happened and how unusual it was that Trump in only 4 years domesticated the GOP in this fashion, because often authoritarians who managed to do this, they either created their own parties, like Mussolini and Berlusconi, or they had backing in institutions that are very prominent in the country, like Bolsonaro in the military. But Trump had neither of this, and he came in from outside, and he was able to do this with astonishing speed. So the GOP's remaking of itself into his personal tool was reflected in its 2020 party platform, which was reduced to expressing support for the president. So politics becomes hollowed out in a sense and reduced to, it revolves around the leader. And the party's time and resources become hijacked in a way by the leader's personal agendas and needs. And this happened in Italy under Berlusconi, but Berlusconi founded Forza Italia. So again, Trump is unusual in this regard. So of course, this high degree of acclaim and flattery and control and personal power doesn't bring any comfort or security to the strongman, who is pursued by the demon of fear and insecurity. He's worried about having his secrets exposed. And this is why he's constantly talking about witch hunts against him. And Berlusconi and Erdogan and Mussolini also talked about witch hunts. So Trump isn't, the book shows that Trump is not as original or unique or American exceptionalism in anything he's doing. There's a pattern and a playbook for all of this. And fear is why they use buy-offs and threat to tie elites to them, why they throw on a cloak of masculine invincibility. So this is where the machismo comes in, and why they seek out other strong men as partners who will legitimate their authoritarian worldview. And Berlusconi had very strong relationships with Putin and with Gaddafi, and there's often secretive financial interests. And the Trump-Putin relationship is an example. So having it all is never enough for these men, and I'm kind of citing the title of Trump's niece, Mary Trump's book. And they consistently make recourse to behaviors that make them feel safe, but ultimately prove counterproductive. And the more they sense their power is waning, the more these dysfunctional behaviors increase. So they erect walls around themselves, metaphorical walls and sometimes physical walls, because they have bunkers and compounds where they store their loot and they feel safe. And it's a style of governance, and political scientist Jennifer Gandhi has written on this. They're called inner sanctums. I call them cocoons. And these are when you hire and fire constantly and you to get more and more loyal people. So you surround yourself with flatterers and with family members. And so I have a paragraph on sons-in-law who are part of this inner circle, from Mussolini's son-in-law Ciano, who was his kind of prop as foreign minister, Pinochet and Erdogan, and Putin. They all have their sons-in-law, up to Jared Kushner, of course. And so this inner sanctum screens out unwanted criticism and tells the leader only what he wants to hear. Another kind of buffer is personality cult, which I talked about yesterday. And you have the ruler sets up mechanisms, whether it's newsreels or Twitter or rallies, where he has direct and unmediated contact with people. And so he needs his boost of adoring followers who believe often that he rules by divine benediction, no matter how profane his past may be. So many leaders, between this governance structure and the acclaim they seek out from grassroots followers, they come to feel omnipotent and untouchable by misfortune or illness that might fell ordinary men. So their hubris is encouraged. So none of this serves them well. Living inside their cocoon, they come to believe their own propaganda, and anyone around them doesn't last if they tell them the truth. And so their worst traits are encouraged, from paranoia to hubris, and they make bad decisions. So one of the macro themes of the book was to take on this myth of authoritarianism as efficient government that's good for business. The kind of law and order is going to bring calm to society. These are highly chaotic government structures. And I have I put this discussion in the corruption chapter, because it's also about how you weed out expertise, you weed out professionalism. So one of the legacies of authoritarianism are institutions become deprofessionalized, from militaries to civil service to journalism, depending how long the leader has stayed in office and how extreme his control is. So authoritarian history is full of disastrous actions taken out of pride and megalomania, right? The leader's ego out of control. From Benito Mussolini's insistence on entering World War II at Hitler's side against the advice of many of his generals, and we saw how that worked out, to Trump and Bolsonaro's attempt to downplay the coronavirus by claiming it was an enhanced form of the flu. And it's now becoming clear that, that Trump's mismanagement of the pandemic contributed to his loss in November. So they are self-destructive. They are destructive toward others principally, but they are often ultimately self-destructive. So it's not surprising that most of them, or really all of them, leave office involuntarily, and the same brutality and arrogance that helps them come to power, because these are amoral opportunists. And one theme we hear about is that they're genius strategists. Well, they're not. They're more like con men, chess players, and they're supreme. Because they have no morals, they will ally with anyone and they will do anything. And they're very good at spotting moments to manipulate people and circumstances. But so all of this is really good for them for getting to power and staying in power. But it doesn't serve them well when when their support is waning or other circumstances are calling them, are showing that their eclipse is likely. And they experience this as a personal betrayal. And so they become full of rage at their people, often abandoning them and blaming them for the messes that they caused, that they themselves caused. And so if you read the memoirs or the end stage writings, like Mussolini in his final time in the Republic of Salo, when everything was falling apart, or Pinochet, his memoirs, which are really a trip, published after he had to leave, they all have these persecution complexes and victim complexes, and they blame their people. They turn their rage on their people. And you can, a more familiar example, Adolf Hitler retreating to the bunker when the Allies were invading and issuing the Nero decree to turn Germany into a wasteland in terms of its infrastructure, to punish the Germans for not being worthy of him. So that's an important point. The same can be said of Gaddafi, who first he was after over 40 years in power, he couldn't believe that people were rebelling against him when the Arab Spring came to Libya. And he told Christian Amanpour that his people loved him, that they would never turn against him. And then, of course, next stage was rage. So he preferred to drag Libya into a civil war from which it has not really recovered, rather than surrender. And they're also very motivated by, they monitor the ends of each other. So, for example, Gaddafi was traumatized by what happened to Saddam Hussein, and he vowed that he wouldn't end up that way, being pulled out of a hole in the ground, and that's actually exactly how he ended up. And then Putin, there's very interesting commentary that Putin became very worried when he saw Arab Spring, and he watched the film of Gaddafi over and over again. And this is when actually in 2012, he cracked down. And there were big protests over him coming back. But the election was a little bit fraudulent. So they learn from each other, and they do things motivated out of panic at having to maybe meet the ends of others. So that's part of the dynamic. So Trump followed an authoritarian rather than democratic playbook, and it's fitting that he would end up like some well-known autocrats, refusing to accept defeat and surrounding himself with the most extreme loyalists. And you recall that after he went through a series of purges around the election, especially after at the Department of Defense, and I think that, and bringing in more and more extreme people, pardoning people like Mike Flynn, and pardons are a way that authoritarians often issue pardons at moments of reckoning. And what the pardon does for authoritarians is free up criminals to serve them more. So Mike Flynn was doing exactly what he was pardoned to do when he came in and he talked about martial law. And we see Roger Stone, who was pardoned right before Trump left. He's been photographed. He was involved in January 6th. And we're going to see more and more how many of these people who were pardoned and cultivated and brought into the government at the last moment. This is very suspicious. I thought, if you're leaving office, why are you doing purges? That didn't make sense. So I'm going to quote from an op-ed I wrote in November 2020. Strongmen have gained power in different ways over a century, but one thing holds true. They're especially dangerous when their power is threatened. Trump couldn't pull off the solutions that the illiberal contemporaries he admires have used to stay in office, like gaming elections, and Putin's been there 20 years. He has the power to do that. Or consolidating control enough to rule by decree, and his friend Orban has done that in Hungary, which is very sad for Hungarians. And the rage, this is me quoting in November, the rage that will grow in Trump as reality sinks in may make for a rocky transition to Biden's presidency. No means, even a military coup, are off the table at present in his thinking of how to reverse the results of the November 3rd loss. So I just want to quickly unpack what he did only because it draws from all the eras of authoritarian history. And such methods could be normalized for use in the future. He's left a roadmap of what to do for other extremists in the GOP. And it could become, for example, manipulating elections could become the way, and we see this with states are passing intense groups of they're trying to pass bundles of laws to make voting more difficult. So it could become more and more the way the GOP does its business because it is a party with an authoritarian political culture. So first he explored military intervention and of course the summer business around Lafayette Square, flooding DC with troops unmarked and marked. This was a rehearsal. I always saw this as a rehearsal. So he explored some kind of military intervention, and this is why General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, came forth all of a sudden to say, oh, you know what? The armed forces is not going to obey an individual, but only the Constitution. So that was kind of shut down. But then he was trying the 21st century trick of electoral manipulation, pressuring officials to find votes, and many of you are familiar with that part of things. And this is, of course, how authoritarianism already operates in Erdogan's Turkey and other places. Electoral results that don't go your way become just another piece of information to be denied and replaced with a fabrication. So it goes with the strategies of propaganda and disinformation. So you create the reality electorally that you need to stay in office. So he set a precedent for Americans, saying he won the election and then attempting to manipulate the votes to make that claim true. So the fact it didn't work is no less serious because with the right players, if the Georgia Secretary of State and a few other individuals or judges had been different, he might have won the election. And this, we really, it was closer than it may seem. And finally, he channeled early fascism in calling on extremist military groups he'd been cultivating for 5 years, if you include his candidacy, to stop this deal and rescue him from defeat. As I said yesterday, this is his personality cult, the leader cult's really, really important here, that they came to rescue him from an unjust fate. And this is very fascist vibe here, as well as military coup vibe. And at the rally, he stoked their anger. He played the victim, but he also told them he loved them and they were special and they shouldn't take it anymore. So this emotional bond, as I said yesterday, is part of the incitement. I'm saying this because the impeachment trial for the crime of incitement opens today in America. And I want to say a word about the followers, because we don't maybe talk enough about them, in the sense that these moments when the leader is in danger, when his power looks like it could be eclipsed, it's very dangerous for them too. Now, elites are very good at scrambling and trying to sniff the wind to see which way things are going to go. But for grassroots followers, it can become very volatile. And again, Trump achieved something very notable in getting people to bond to him to that extent in just a few years, that their world is collapsing. And here we have the comfort of this conspiracy theories like QAnon, which overlap with the Trump cult to a large extent. So if you add in then the culture of armed extremism and our gun policies, and I'm talking about not having a farmer having a rifle at home, but people who amass arsenals, military grade arsenals. If you add that in, the solution of direct action, which is extremism, an armed takeover of the halls of power to save the leader, this was the final gambit. This was the final attempt. So just quickly, I want to go over a couple of lessons from exits from power, because as we see that even when these men do leave one way or the other, they cast a long shadow over their countries. Their personality cults, the support they have from elites and grassroots followers can last, can endure, even if they're dead. Of course, we're going to talk about cases in which they're not dead. And it can influence the process of transition. It can complicate that process and hinder the next government's attempts to strengthen or rebuild democracy. So just one that I'll mention is allowing strongmen to retain authority after they've been voted out is a bad idea. It's dangerous. And precisely because they become vindictive and there's so much at stake prosecution-wise and psychologically, and it's their legacy of policies. Their whole world is being shattered. So Augusto Pinochet is a good example here. He came to power in Chile, military coup, 1973. But by the mid-80s, the support he had from his US backers and economic distress created from his neoliberal policies, we don't hear about that enough, and rising, which created mass protests from the early 80s on, very courageous mass protests. So he got himself into a situation where he had to agree to a plebiscite to be held in 1988. Should he continue in rule or not? It's a huge thing. So it was 15 years in power and with torture, a true military junta with a personalist leader. And he's important in my book because although he had a junta, collective council of rulers, very early on, he emerged as the king. And he sat in the throne and he wouldn't take there's a famous picture of him, he wouldn't take his sunglasses off. And that was like right after the coup. So to his astonishment, Chileans voted no, he shouldn't continue. And when a presidential election was held in 1989, he lost. So he was allowed, though, he had quite a cushy exit package. He was allowed to stay on as head of the armed forces for several years. And he had, more importantly for us, he could stay on as president for over a year. So he spent that time trying to sabotage the incoming democracy. He stacked the Chilean Supreme Court to make sure his loyalists would have a majority. He presented the plebiscite, all of his allied media presented the plebiscite as an illegitimate conspiracy against him, trying to cast doubt on the votes. And he passed laws that made it more difficult to prosecute his military torturers and undertake democratic reforms. So we have, by our 20th Amendment, this lame duck period, this long period. And in 1933, it was actually decreased so that it only goes, it goes up to January from November. But we see the example of Trump shows that, democracy is an honor system. And we expect someone to leave office and to be the lame duck president and not get in the way of the transition. But somebody with a mentality like Trump, you see what happened. He had a very long time to pressure elected officials to plan this military coup attempt. And now many more things are coming out about this proceeding throughout the month of December, complicated logistics. So, is it time to rethink this long period, which is not typical of many other countries, especially countries with a past of dictatorship or juntas? So this is one example of Trump leaving a roadmap for resisting, and we voted him out, but leaving a roadmap and raising questions about what can we do institutionally, legally, et cetera, to bolster our democracy. So I will conclude there. And glad to take questions.
Great, thank you so much. The floor is open for questions, but can I ask you please to raise your hand to signal that you would like us to call on you, and then we can unmute you. I see some hands already. If you don't mind, I was actually hoping to open with a question, because you have an article from several years ago now on fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, a lesser evil.
Yeah.
You made a case that I found really insightful that I've used in a number of courses on instead of looking at body counts, you talk about sort of desensitization and what these authoritarian movements can do to desensitize a country or a culture or a people. And so I was wondering if you might be able to reflect, given the topic of today's lecture and the historical moment you're describing on, is it possible to resensitize people after an experience?
But that's a really great question, because, when these types of people come to office, even if they don't wreck democracy today altogether, they do their best to incite polarization, which is a survivalist mentality, so that people are turned against each other, and to vigorously, day after day, kind of encourage compassion and empathy for others to lessen. And in fact, to be not worth it for people. And what they do instead is they incentivize informing, sometimes, mistrust. And here in the 21st century, mistrust of reality, mistrust of what others tell you. So there's many people who have rifts in their family now in America. This is very tragic. My own mother, who's in the UK, has been radicalized during the pandemic by watching RT. She used to be a Sky News conservative, and I can't get through to her. And she doesn't believe that RT, which is, of course, Russia Today, is Kremlin propaganda. So she's getting bad health advice. She doesn't trust people anymore. She's become even more racist. And I cannot, I make progress and then it backslides. So that's just a personal story. But I think that leadership really matters. And I think, for example, what Biden's been doing, and this is less about his policies because he just got there than the tone he's been setting. That is decency, lowering the temper of debate, being kind of saying less and meaning it more, and encouraging empathy and trust, because one of the biggest problems of desensitization, it comes when you don't have trust. So you become both desensitized to violence, it becomes just part of your reality, and this is where trauma happens, but you also become numb and hopeless. And the real thing that authoritarians want is for us to lose hope. And I think one of the most awful things that Trump said, there's many, was when he was presented with the latest spiraling death rates from COVID, he said, "It is what it is." And I have a similar quote from Gaddafi in a different context, but think about that. It is what it is. This is telling you to not try and better your circumstance. You accept what's happening. It's a fatalistic, it's a resignation. And this is part of the danger. Trump knew very well what he was doing with this. It's an emotional training. And there's a lot of interesting work, particularly for German history, on the emotional training Nazism gave and the attempts to undo this after Nazism.
Thank you so much. I see one hand from Marie-Claire Klassen.
Thanks so much for your presentation. My question has to do with what role does religion play in authoritarianism and its rise? So what I'm thinking of here, for example, is Trump was referred to in some evangelical circles as the new Cyrus. He had a huge following from evangelical leaders like Dr. James Dobson, who have radio programs that promoted this. And I was wondering to what extent this is unique to America. How does it map onto other authoritarian regimes? What are sort of the patterns of using religion in this way? And finally, if you have any thoughts on, how we move forward or respond. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. So yesterday, I showed a slide of evangelicals laying hands on Trump. And one of the sad things, and just from my point of view, is that it started with Mussolini, but it's goes through Trump. It's the most profane and impious and criminal people who are embraced by religious institutions. So I'm not talking about grassroots faith, I'm talking about institutions. They embrace these kinds of people because those people deliver for them. And this is where the fact that they are amoral. Mussolini was a huge atheist. He was such an anti-clerical that he wrote a book in his youth about a cardinal who had a mistress. He loved to show the hypocrisy in his mind of the church. And yet it was Mussolini who made the deal very, very early on with the Vatican. Years of negotiations went into the Lateran Accords, and very sad. And I hope that people do more research on this or bring it to the public. There was a progressive Catholic party led by Luigi Sturzo, a priest, and they were thrown under the bus. Sturzo was forced to immigrate because it was too threatening to have a progressive, and they in their first appearances, right when fascism was coming in, they did really well at the polls. So you had to get rid of that progressive Christian force, and so Mussolini allied with the Vatican. And so when Trump, Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians started trotting out this business of him being in office by the will of God, I mean, there can't be a more inappropriate person to be acclaimed in this way. He has actually no history of piety of any sort. However, Trump has delivered magnificently for these groups. We haven't even digested the extent to which in the civil service, for example, the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Health and Human Services used to be about civil rights for non-whites. Now it is officially the rights they are concerned with are white Christian rights. So he's delivered in so many ways, judiciary appointments, and of course for Orthodox Jews with in moving the consulate to the embassy to Jerusalem. That's a huge thing, and all the other things they've done there, and that's Kushner's very important there. But I also wanted to highlight in the book how faith can be important, and I didn't say enough about this. It's a problem having a global book goes over a century. Faith is so important to pushing back against authoritarianism. And I think that as we seek to recover from what's happened and strengthen democracy, faith is going to be very important. Now, for some people, that's going to be a kind of secular civic faith, if they're not religious, the faith of patriotism, so civic faith. For many others, I think that there's so many important religious figures in our country who are mobilizing at grassroots level. There's the Reverend Barber. There's from different denominations including Catholic, doing very important work. And I'm going to write more about this. I think that faith is key for, given how important it is in our country. It's key to moving into something better and protecting and having a more just, free society. But we have our work cut out for us because of the strength of the bond of evangelicals to illiberal politics, of many evangelicals. So some of the most influential ones.
Thank you. Robert Mowry? I see a hand raised.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk, which I also attended yesterday. It's all fascinating.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if First of all, I guess I have a couple questions. So one question just would be, you're focused on authoritarian strongmen, but we don't seem to hear much about authoritarian strong women. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. And then the second question is, since you call this the age of the authoritarian strongman that we're currently in, I'm just wondering, I mean, we've seen instances of this in a lot of different countries, like Hungary that you mentioned, or the Philippines, or Brazil, and the United States. But I'm wondering, because depending on how you look at the data and divide up the data can sometimes tell a different story than the impression that we get by looking at a handful of cases. So I'm wondering if you've seen any studies that sort of verify that authoritarianism is on the rise. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that as well.
Yeah, the Freedom, I don't know if you're familiar with the publications of Freedom House. They track authoritarian rise and democratic decline and backsliding, and they issue reports throughout the year, but they have annual reports that very clearly track that more countries are vulnerable or have been, or have somebody of authoritarian leanings. The issue with this is that, when I started saying in 2016, for example, that Trump was authoritarian, people were, that's crazy. And they've continued to say, some people, that less after January 6th. Actually, some of the most famous people who, like Shadi Hamid, they would always have us on TV together to debate. And then he actually reversed his position after January 6th. But it's easy to say, well, what are you talking about? We have a free society and you're not in jail, you're able to talk. That's not authoritarianism. And that's true. But everybody started somewhere. And so it's too easy. It's not useful to compare it in that way to Putin, who's been there 20 years, or Orban 10 years. It's something that happens day after day, year after year. And it took Orban a long time to get to a point where he rules by decree. Erdogan was already, it took him a while, and then the coup attempt speeded everything up for him. So sometimes there are these shock events that speed things up. So that's one of the problems in what is the tipping point where you start to say that, and Freedom House and other places like it have criteria, right? How much repression of the press, how many people are in jail. Otherwise, it's dangerous. And so they track trends. So that's important. As for the women, I talk about this in the introduction and the conclusion. I decided, so of course there were tyrants in the past who were women, but I'm looking at 21st century. There are women who had strong leader characteristics, like Margaret Thatcher, whose nickname was Iron Lady, or Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir, and they did illiberal things. But I wanted to look at people who really damaged or wrecked a democracy. And I also, I wanted to take seriously this business of machismo and virility, because it's important that possessing bodies, female bodies, controlling, is part of the playbook. And I have a chapter that some people can't really read easily about, Mussolini had, and Gaddafi. It was as though Jeffrey Epstein was the head of government, and government was turned into a sex trafficking and sex ring operation, where you use your secret police, and women were recruited and taken and raped and by the leader and his cronies. So this is, it becomes criminals in power. But so I wanted to kind of, precisely because a lot of these men are aging, and women are very important in the far right, both in Germany and Europe, other places, and in our country. They're becoming very prominent. So this configuration of this strongman isn't going to last. And I wanted to kind of, at the end of a century of it, give a snapshot of it, give an analysis of it. But it also means that if somebody like Ivanka Trump, who's been marketed very scary, as a world leader are ready for years. Like, and this was such a failure of diplomacy at the G20 in 2019. I will never get over this. Ivanka Trump was in the world leader photo, and she was in the center. She was there as though she was a world leader. Why was she allowed? Why was Justin Trudeau and all the other, why did they let her in there? I don't know. But that doesn't promise well at all. So if someone like that comes to power, no, she's not going to be taking off her shirt and showing her, pecs like Putin does or Mussolini did. But the same corruption, the same racism, the same anti-worker and dignity of life, all of the rest will still be there. So I don't have any illusions. And I also think Le Pen is doing really well in France. So we will have an authoritarian leaning state led by a woman, maybe even soon.
Thank you. I see a raised hand from Ruben.
Hi, thank you so much for your work. It's been really helpful. The last, I think I first heard about you when you gave a talk with Kate Mann.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed a lot. So thank you. I am wondering how you think about. I'm sort of still forming this idea, but the shared, I guess, where accountability is or responsibility, because I found myself thinking a lot of trying to figure out how much we should put on, Trump or these specific authoritarians versus it seems clear, I guess to my mind, it also seems clear in part of what we have to look at, and not that you're not saying that, but how ready so many people are to support leaders like this.
Yeah, that's really important.
Yeah. And I mean, to be honest, I also think on the personal level, some of my family it feels like have gotten more and more conservative and more close, continue to be more and more okay with everything that's happening. So I think in a way it's sort of this personal struggle of like, what do we do about that, and not wanting to sort of let ourselves off the hook because by overly saying, oh, that Trump's out now, things are okay, which I'm not hearing you say that at all. I just wonder how you approach that question.
No, it's I make it, the book really it makes the argument that leaders matter, they set the tone, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very clear that they're nothing without their enablers. And it's really shocking to the extent to which what's happened in 2016 and since mirrors the dynamics that have been going on since the fascist years, where conservative elites, and we include religious elites and business elites, all kinds of elites, political, they bring in the extremist. The extremist depends on, this is Trump included, depends on them to be brought into the system. The GOP had to accord him the Republican nomination. And so I tracked this quite carefully. So just a few weeks after Trump made his speech, which freaked me out to no end, about shooting someone. So this was Democratic candidates with a small d, they don't do that. They don't talk about shooting people. This was a test. And then Jeff Sessions, brought him came to one of his rallies, and this was the mainstreaming moment. And because he depended on people like Paul Ryan and Jeff Sessions and Mitch McConnell to give him access to the system, just like Mussolini and Hitler were invited in by the elites who thought they could control him. So I have quotes in the book that it's really sad. The same people, the same quotes in different times and places with the same psychological dynamic and political dynamic. We're going to bring him in. We're going to control him. We'll make him our tool. And then, of course, he makes them his tool, right? And incredibly, this even happens in situations of military coup, where you think, well, wait, there is no process nobody's running for office. But in Chile, the Christian Democrats, who were conservatives, a former president Eduardo Frei Montalva, who was a big force still, he believed, and he said so publicly, that he thought that the junta would restore order and calm everything down. And then he believed what Pinochet, et cetera, was telling him, that they would return power to democracy. And originally they were supposed to return power in 6 months, and then it became never. But when Eduardo Frei Montalva realized he'd been conned, he started speaking out against Pinochet. And in 1982, he went into the hospital for an operation, very dangerous in authoritarian states, and he was poisoned. And it took until only very recently, like in the last year, were documents released that prove he was poisoned. His family wouldn't give up to know the truth. So even when there's a coup, these elites they're not seeing what's in front of them, or they're making strategic decisions because they want the left to be tamed. They want to keep their privilege. And so they make these partnerships. And so the book is, I talk about that. They're like parasites, these men, and they depend on the goodwill of preachers, of bankers, and they're nothing without them.
Thank you. John Welly would like to ask a question.
Okay. Yes. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, John.
Nice to see you. Thank
Nice
you.
to see you.
And your virtual presence at Notre Dame. I wanted to ask you a question that has two parts. The first is, it has to do with Mussolini, but then it has a comparative aspect. What do you think of the recent work in Italy by Antonio Scurati, the two biographies in the form of novels? The first one, Il Figlio del Secolo, that won the Strega Prize, and then the follow-up, L'Uomo della Provvidenza. So the first part of the question is, what do you think of the work in itself, and what does it say about the reception of the work? What does it say about how people are thinking and feeling about Mussolini today in Italy? That's the first part. And the second part is, in your comparative work, do you find other romanticized or novelized biographies of other strong men, or what's the literature of strong men, if there is one, as there is with this, so I mean, during the lifetime of Mussolini, we have a history of biographies, obviously important points in his development, and after his death now, this kind of these recent novels. I wonder what you think about the novels themselves, and then the question about other strong men, and also the kind of literature about strong men.
I don't really know about the literature besides the Mussolini case. I know there's a whole tradition of hagiographies of, like Nicholas Farrell wrote, who's a right-wing journalist in the UK, wrote a very complimentary biography of Mussolini that Stephen Bannon loves, with all the myths of making the trains run on time and all this crap. But I don't know. I mean, I think there's a very strong hagiographical tradition for certainly in Chile with Pinochet. And then there are memory sites that are formed, like you have Predapio in Italy, you have Pinochet's library, and Francisco Franco's foundation. So that's, but I don't know about the exact literature. I'm sure somebody's written about it. Scurati, I was looking behind because I was trying to find the book. Oh, here it is. I just actually wanted, it's important to show it. So this is a fascist era font, and it's recalling, it's a call to fascist nostalgia in its graphic, in its cover, in its visual identity. I had big problems with this. In fact, I was supposed to write about it for the New Yorker, and we didn't publish the piece. I was very angry about this book. Now I'm a little more balanced about it over time, but I was very frightened by the book, and it's become a bestseller because using the novelist's ability to get to emotional truths, he was able to recreate also this terrible misogyny and violence. And I think that this scared me a lot, because for every one person who may take away an intellectual lesson about the appeal, because we do have to understand the appeal of these men. And it's also why I put the virility chapter in there, about the appeal of their glamour as men and power. So for every person who might take away the anti-fascist message that Scurati keeps saying he has in doing this, there's probably 4 people, given the climate in Italy today, that are seeing this. And again, Mondadori, Bompiani, did they have to do this? It's a monument to Mussolini, in a way. And there's too many nostalgic people who can appreciate that. So it continues the edifice of his grandeur. And for those who, I mentioned this yesterday, for those who weren't there, Italy has a very particular memory politics. They did not have a degree of denazification. And this was partly because the Allies didn't want to have a thorough purge, because they didn't want to destabilize Italy because of the Cold War. Because unlike Germany, Italy had a huge communist party. So we cannot blame the Italians totally for this cover up. It was like the cult of Mussolini went underground, and literally the Allies put plywood and curtains over a lot of the propaganda, but didn't destroy it as they did in Nazi Germany. And so this has left a kind of undigested memory. And I had the PowerPoint, but I urge you to just Google it. Things happen where, for example, I mentioned this yesterday, but it's very apropos here. The Foro Italico, which used to be the Foro Mussolini, is a big sports complex in Rome. It has mosaics about squadrism. It has M's, just like this one. It's a fascist. It's a kind of glory of fascist architecture, and it has a conference room that has a giant painting of Mussolini. Like, we're talking huge, okay? And it's called The Apotheosis of Fascism. And in it, Mussolini is like a god surrounded by his followers with black shirts. It's really leader cult. So left-wing and center-left prime ministers have held international press conferences, especially if they have to do with sports, in this room, photographed under the painting. So this is like Angela Merkel would not be photographed under a painting of Hitler. This is the difference. So as late as 2014, the center-left young Prime Minister Matteo Renzi, certainly no fascist sympathies, he thought it was a good idea to sit under the portrait of Mussolini. So I wrote a piece for the New Yorker instead on this, and pointed out how it's like Mussolini's still haunting. He's like there on top of him. And it was not appreciated by Italians at all, this piece. It caused a bit of a scandal. But that's to answer your question. There's still a lot of work to be done, and this is in some ways not helpful. And I haven't read the second one yet. I have to read it. But so I just have a very strong reaction to it. But that's partly what he wanted. He's a good novelist in that way, right?
Thank you. I think we have time for one last quick question. I see one more hand up. So can I ask Peter Kocha to ask the last question of today?
Thank you. Professor, thank you very much. I enjoyed your speech yesterday and your also today. My question very briefly is, one thing I think we all have learned in the last 4 years is that we cannot take our democracy for granted. And so I was wondering, what do you see as going forward as the most important guardrails for our democracy, especially in light of the fact that Trump supporters, overwhelming number of Trump supporters are still following in his path and in his shadow?
That's a great question. I think that certainly we've got a roadmap now of things that could have been, how we could have avoided this. And one which people like the former assistant FBI director, Frank Filiuzzi, are talking about, background checks, making sure people are fit for service, making sure they disclose their financials. Because, I'm sure you've heard this, it's been, there's less vetting of a presidential candidate than there is for somebody who works at a department store or a bank. And that makes no sense. So that's one, because again, not to put it all on the leader, but the story of Trump is the story of what one individual can do. Somebody before talked about how people can be, activated, and what the research on authoritarianism shows is that most populations, there is like maybe a third of the population that has these tendencies, but it takes an individual to come in the right time with the right skills, which is also skills in manipulating people, disinformation, a certain kind of commanding man in the past, who activates and legitimates all this extremism, all these yearnings for order, which is also a yearning for lawlessness, as I talked about yesterday. And then once that's activated, it's hard to put it back in. So vetting of the leader is important, but we also have to solve the problem of disinformation. And part of that is not governmental, but of course, to do with Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and other platforms. So I think we need to approach the whole menu of corruption, propaganda, which include disinformation, machismo, in the sense of we also need to rethink our attachment to a certain kind of glamorous male figures, and because personality cults happen all the time in business too. The example of WeWork with Adam Neumann is very interesting. So I think we're ripe for a rethinking of power, more collaboration, more horizontal, less vertical. So as well as, I think too, last thing I'll say is we need national commissions and also investigations in our institutions like the military to find out the scope of extremism. And also we need sensible gun control, because extremists are nothing without their weapons. Again, I'm referring to people who are able to have grenades, rocket launchers, military grade weapons that I personally don't believe citizens have any need to have those.
Thank you. I hope you'll all join me in thanking once again our speaker, Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Thank you for two really wonderful events last night and this afternoon. And thanks again to the Kellogg Institute, to the Nanovic, and to the Center for Italian Studies for co-sponsoring these events. But thank you very much.
Thank you. And I have a website that's www.ruthbenghiat.com, where all my stuff is. And I also, a lot of my ideas start on Twitter, which could be sad to some, but that's how life is. I learn a lot from Twitter and I use it a lot. So it's just at Ruth Ben-Ghiat. And then I develop them into op-eds and papers and publications. So thank you so much. I enjoyed the questions.
Thank you.